The sound of my body hitting the hardwood floor at our annual Christmas dinner was not a thud, but a sickening crack that seemed to echo through the dining room like a gunshot, instantly silencing the festive chatter of 23 family members. I lay there for a moment, stunned, staring at the intricate patterns of the Persian rug my late father had bought in Istanbul 30 years ago, smelling the sharp scent of lemon floor polish mixed with the metallic tang of blood from where I had bitten my lip. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest harder than the fall itself. In that frozen eternity, I waited for a hand to reach down, for a voice to cry out in concern, or for my mother to rush from the head of the table to check on her only biological child. Instead, all I heard was the soft tinkle of ice in a crystal glass and the heavy, ragged breathing of my stepfather, Frank, who stood over me like a conqueror, surveying a defeated enemy.
I am Simona Cunningham, 29 years old, a senior compliance officer who spends her days hunting down corporate fraud. Yet in that moment, I was just a helpless little girl again, watching the only family I had left turn their backs on me. I realised then that rock bottom is not just a place you visit. It is a basement with no lights, smelling of Frank's cheap cologne and the pine needles from the Christmas tree he had forced my mother to buy. To understand why a grown woman was shoved out of her chair at a holiday gathering, you have to understand the toxic ecosystem that is the Cunningham-Morrison household. The evening had started with the usual performative happiness, where we all wore matching cashmere sweaters that scratched my skin, and pretended that Frank had not spent the last decade systematically dismantling my father's legacy. Frank had been drinking since noon, pouring Trader Joe's wine into a crystal decanter and swirling it around as if it were a vintage Bordeaux, lecturing my cousins about work ethic, while his own hands had not done an honest day of labour since he married my mother. He kept making snide comments about my seat at the table, the high-backed oak chair that had belonged to my father, the one place in the house I still felt connected to the man who raised me. Frank called it premium real estate and muttered about how some people earn their seats at the head of the table, while others just squat in them like tenants who refuse to pay rent. My cousin Jennifer kept shooting me sympathetic looks across the centerpiece, her eyes widening every time Frank's voice rose an octave, but even she remained silent, trapped in the gravitational pull of Frank's volatile temper. I kept my eyes on the grandfather clock in the corner, watching the second hand sweep past the Roman numerals, counting down the minutes until I could politely excuse myself and escape back to the sanity of my lonely apartment. At exactly 7:47 in the evening, the front door burst open with a dramatic flare that sucked the oxygen out of the room, announcing the arrival of my stepsister, Brittany. She was 2 hours late, carrying 4 designer shopping bags, despite having declared bankruptcy less than a month ago, and she swept into the dining room bringing a gust of cold air and the overwhelming scent of vanilla perfume. Frank's face transformed instantly, the scowl replaced by a beaming smile that looked almost painful in its intensity, as if the second coming of a deity had just walked in wearing Louboutins. He stood up, swaying slightly from the wine, and announced to the room that his real daughter had finally arrived and needed a proper place to sit. Before I could even process what was happening, he marched over to where I was sitting, grabbed the back of my chair with both hands, and yanked it backward with a violence that sent the heavy oak legs screeching against the floor. He shouted that I needed to move, that this seat was for his real daughter, and when I did not scramble away fast enough to satisfy him, he shoved my shoulder with his free hand. I tried to stand, but my heels caught in the thick tablecloth, dragging the cranberry sauce and the gravy boat down with me as I tumbled backward, my hip taking the full force of the impact against the unyielding wood. The aftermath of the fall was a study in human cowardice that I will never forget as long as I live. Cranberry sauce had splattered across my grandmother's vintage lace dress, looking like a gruesome crime scene, and gravy was slowly pooling around my ruined silk blouse. My grandmother let out a tiny, scandalized gasp, the kind she usually reserved for when a neighbor painted their front door the wrong shade of beige. But she did not move to help me.
Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Uncle Ted holding his smartphone up, the red recording light blinking steadily as he captured my humiliation for his social media feed, probably already thinking of a witty caption to go with the video. But the most devastating reaction came from my mother. She sat at the opposite end of the table, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth, her face arranged in that frozen, vacant expression she had perfected over the last 10 years. It was the face of a woman who had learned that seeing nothing and saying nothing was the only way to survive in Frank's world. She looked right at me, her eyes glassy and distant, and then looked down at her plate, carefully slicing a piece of ham, as if her daughter were not lying on the floor, covered in food and bruises. As I struggled to push myself up, fighting the sharp, hot pain radiating from my hip, I heard Frank mutter to Brittany that she should sit down and that I should be grateful I was even allowed inside the house, considering how much of his money I had wasted over the years. That comment about his money was the spark that finally ignited the powder keg of rage I had been suppressing for a decade. As I stood there, wiping gravy from my arm and trying to salvage a shred of dignity, my eyes locked onto the kitchen counter where Frank had carelessly left his business phone face up and unlocked. In my world of corporate compliance and forensic accounting, we call that a critical security vulnerability. But in that moment, I called it a weapon. Frank was too busy fawning over Brittany, pouring her wine and asking about her shopping spree, to notice me quietly moving toward the kitchen under the pretense of finding a towel. I swiped the phone, slipped it into my pocket, and walked out the front door without saying a single word to anyone. As I sat in my car, shaking from adrenaline and shock, I realized I had left my coat behind. But I did not care, because hidden under the passenger seat was my father's old laptop, a device I had retrieved from the garage months ago and never had the courage to open. Tonight, fueled by the throbbing pain in my hip and the image of my mother's indifference, I knew the time for courage had finally arrived. I drove home in silence, the city lights blurring through my tears, knowing that the Simona who had walked into that dinner was dead, and the woman driving away was ready to burn everything to the ground. To truly understand the magnitude of what I was about to do, you have to understand the slow, insidious takeover that had occurred over the last 10 years. Frank Morrison had entered our lives 2 years after my father died, appearing at our church's grief support group, like a predator sensing a wounded animal. He presented himself as a wealthy, retired investor, a man of God who just wanted to help a widow manage her burden. But looking back, he was more like a wolf attending a sheep convention. He zeroed in on my mother with terrifying precision, isolating her from her friends, taking over the finances, and slowly replacing her personality with a hollow echo of his own opinions. The favoritism began almost immediately after they married. When Brittany turned 18, Frank bought her a brand new Honda Civic with a giant red bow on the roof, claiming she needed safe transportation for her social life. When I turned 18 a month later, Frank handed me a plastic bus pass and delivered a 20-minute lecture on the virtues of self-sufficiency and public transportation. I remember laughing at the time, thinking he was just trying to teach me the value of $1, not realizing that he was actually funding Brittany's lifestyle with the money my father had set aside for my future. The financial abuse was subtle at first, buried in complex jargon that my mother did not understand and was too grief-stricken to question. My father had built a small but highly profitable logistics company from nothing, a business that was supposed to be my legacy and my mother's security. Frank convinced my mother to appoint him as the CEO, claiming that a woman should not have to worry her pretty head about supply chains and payroll when she was still mourning. I watched helplessly as he moved into my father's office, threw out the family photos, and replaced them with framed pictures of himself playing golf. He started driving my father's vintage Mercedes, treating it like a go-kart, and firing the loyal employees who had been with us since the beginning. When I went to college, I discovered that the education trust fund my father had shown me years ago was mysteriously empty. Frank explained it away as market volatility and bad investments, shrugging his shoulders while simultaneously finding $60,000 to pay for Brittany's tuition at a private art college, where she majored in abstract expressionism, before dropping out to become an influencer. I ended up working 3 jobs to put myself through accounting school, eating instant noodles while Brittany posted photos of her weekend trips to Cabo San Lucas on the family credit card. The turning point in my suspicion came 3 years ago during a Thanksgiving dinner where Frank had drunk too much scotch and left his laptop open on the coffee table. I had glanced at the screen and seen an email from a bank in the Cayman Islands, a jurisdiction that a small domestic logistics company had absolutely no business dealing with. I started paying closer attention after that, noticing the way Frank would sweat when the mail arrived, the way he would intercept phone calls, and the way the company's profits seemed to shrink every quarter, despite business booming in the logistics sector. I used my growing skills as a compliance officer to do some digging, but Frank was careful, hiding behind layers of passwords and threats. It was my grandmother who finally gave me the key. Last year, she had pulled me into the pantry, her hands trembling as she pressed a small, dusty USB drive into my palm. She whispered that she had found it, taped under my father's desk in the garage, before Frank threw the desk away, and that she thought my father would have wanted me to have it. She told me not to let Frank know, her eyes darting toward the door with genuine fear, and then she went back to stirring the soup as if nothing had happened. That drive had been sitting in my safe for a year, a terrifying Pandora's box that I was too scared to open until Frank pushed me onto the floor. Now, sitting in my dark apartment with a bag of frozen peas on my hip and a glass of cheap whiskey in my hand, I placed the stolen phone on the table next to my father's battered laptop. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the cold, crystalline clarity in my mind. I plugged in the USB drive my grandmother had given me, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I typed in the password. My birthday, written out as words just like my father always taught me. The screen flickered to life, revealing a file structure that was meticulously organized, a digital ghost of my father's brilliant mind. There were folders labeled insurance, deeds, and one that made my breath hitch in my throat. In case of emergency. I opened it and found a video file dated 3 weeks before his death, along with a scanned document titled The Real Will. I clicked on the document first, and as I read the legal jargon, the room seemed to spin. My father had not left everything to my mother unconditionally. He had created a trust, a protected entity that was supposed to lock the company and the house away until I turned 30. Specifically to prevent someone like Frank from seizing control. The document revealed that my mother was only supposed to receive an allowance and that the core assets were never to be transferred into anyone else's name. This meant that every single thing Frank had done for the last 10 years, mortgaging the house, selling company assets, transferring funds, was not just unethical, it was illegal. It was fraud on a massive federal scale. I looked over at Frank's phone, which was buzzing with text messages. I picked it up, my heart pounding against my ribs, and saw a string of frantic messages from someone named Carl. The texts were explicit, discussing offshore accounts, shell companies, and a loan shark named Big Tony, who was demanding payment by the end of the week. I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that Frank wasn't just a greedy stepfather. He was a desperate criminal running a Ponzi scheme, using my father's legacy as collateral. I had the evidence of the original will on the laptop, and I had the evidence of the active crimes on the phone. I sat there in the dark, the light of the 2 screens illuminating my face, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the executioner. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing the data. I took photos of every text message, every email, and every bank notification on Frank's phone using my own secure device.
I found emails between Frank and my mother where he had bullied her into signing documents she clearly didn't understand, threatening that the IRS would take the house if she didn't sign. I found proof that he had been intercepting the statements from the real trust and forging fake reports to show that the money was gone. But the most damning piece of evidence was a folder on his phone labelled Brittany's Expenses. It was a detailed ledger of over $200,000 siphoned directly from the company payroll accounts to pay for Brittany's failed businesses, her credit card debt, and her luxury car leases. He was stealing from the employees' pension fund to pay for his daughter's handbags. The rage I felt was so cold it burned. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. on Christmas Day. I cracked my knuckles, opened a new email draft, and began to type. This wasn't just going to be a lawsuit. This was going to be a nuclear strike. I sat in the glow of the laptop screen, my finger hovering over the enter key, feeling like a pilot about to drop a payload that would reshape the landscape forever. I had spent the last 3 hours drafting a series of emails that were masterpieces of corporate destruction, each one tailored to inflict maximum damage on a specific target within Frank's house of cards. The first email was addressed to the State Attorney General's office and the IRS tip line, with a subject line that simply read, quote, 0, containing 47 attachments documenting 5 years of cooked books, hidden offshore accounts, and the illegal use of pension funds. The second email was scheduled for Frank's business partners, Carl, Fred, Rick, Andy, Uma, and Derek, a group of men who thought they were investing in a legitimate logistics expansion, but were actually funding a Ponzi scheme. I attached the real balance sheets, showing their investments had been transferred to a shell company in Belize, controlled solely by Frank. The third email was the most personal, sent directly to the creditors listed in Frank's phone, men with names like Big Tony and Vegas Mike, informing them that their debtor was not only insolvent, but was actively hiding assets in his stepdaughter's trust, which I made clear was legally untouchable by them. Finally, I composed an email to my mother, attaching the scanned copy of my father's real will and a spreadsheet detailing every single dollar Frank had stolen from her while she was blinded by grief. I set the delivery time for 3 o'clock in the morning, a time when the world was asleep but the servers were wide awake, ensuring that by the time Frank opened his eyes, his digital execution would already be complete. I woke up at 5:58 in the morning on Christmas Day, exactly 2 minutes before my alarm was set to go off, with a strange sense of calm settling over me like a heavy blanket. I walked into my small kitchen, the hardwood floor cold against my bare feet, and went through the ritual of making coffee with deliberate slowness, measuring the grounds and listening to the water boil while I waited for the chaos to begin. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, directly below the penthouse suite that my father had bought and which Frank now occupied like a squatter king. At exactly 6:23 in the morning, the silence of the building was shattered, not by a scream, but by a ringtone. I could hear Frank's phone buzzing through the floorboards, a relentless, drilling sound that signaled the beginning of the end. Then came another ring, and another, a cacophony of electronic demands that refused to be ignored. I sat in my father's old leather reading chair, sipping my black coffee and visualizing the scene upstairs. Frank fumbling for his glasses, seeing the notifications pile up like snowdrifts, his face draining of colour as he realised that the walls he had built were made of paper, and I had just lit a match. By 6:45, the ringing was continuous, a frantic soundtrack to his unravelling life, and I knew that Big Tony and the IRS were not the kind of people who left voicemails politely. I opened the family WhatsApp group on my phone to check the temperature of the water, and I was greeted by a digital riot that warmed my cold heart. Uncle Ted's video of Frank shoving me had not just stayed within the family, it had somehow migrated to TikTok overnight, tagged with phrases like evil stepdad and Christmas karma,
and had already racked up 50,000 views and thousands of comments calling for Frank's head on a platter. The family chat was exploding with screenshots of the video and confused messages from relatives who were waking up to find their family drama trending on social media. Cousin Jennifer had posted a message demanding to know what the hell was wrong with Uncle Ted for posting it. But Aunt Martha had chimed in, saying that the behaviour was disgusting and the world needed to see it. Frank had typed a message at 6:31 in the morning, all in capital letters, asking me what I had done. A desperate plea that he tried to delete a minute later, but 17 people had already screenshotted it. The digital footprint of his cruelty was spreading faster than he could scrub it, and for the first time, the narrative was slipping out of his control. I watched the little typing bubbles appear and disappear as family members argued, realizing that the silence that had protected Frank for 10 years had finally been broken by the collective noise of the internet. By 7 o'clock, the storm moved from the digital world to my physical doorstep. There was no pounding or aggressive shouting this time. Instead, there was a pathetic, scratching knock that sounded like a dog begging to be let in out of the rain. I looked through the peephole and saw Frank standing in the hallway, wearing his silk Christmas pajamas that were now wrinkled and stained with sweat, holding a phone in each hand that were both lighting up with incoming calls he was too terrified to answer. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 30 minutes, his skin grey and sagging, his eyes darting around the hallway as if he expected the FBI to rappel from the ceiling at any moment. Behind him, Brittany was pacing back and forth, screaming into her own phone about her credit cards being declined at Starbucks on Christmas morning, her voice echoing off the walls with the shrill entitlement of someone who has never heard the word, quote, 3. She was demanding that Frank fix it immediately, threatening to tell everyone about his side business if he didn't restore her access to the funds, a threat that made my ears perk up, because even I didn't know the full extent of this, quote, 4. I opened the door slowly, leaning against the frame with my coffee mug in hand, and watched as Frank looked up at me with wet, pleading eyes, realizing that the nobody he had pushed around was the one holding the keys to his destruction. My mother arrived at my door 30 minutes later, looking like a ghost who had been startled back to life. She was still wearing her nightgown with a heavy wool coat thrown hastily over it, her hair unbrushed, clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline. The look on her face wasn't the anger or sadness I had expected. It was the shell-shocked expression of someone waking up from a decade-long coma to find the world had changed unrecognizable. She had read the email. She had seen the real will, the document that proved her husband had tried to protect her, and the spreadsheet that proved her new husband had been robbing her blind while she wept for the old one. Frank tried to intercept her, reaching out with a trembling hand to grab her arm, muttering about misunderstandings and hackers, but she flinched away from him as if he were radioactive. The hallway became a theatre of the absurd. Frank's phones ringing with calls from furious investors, Brittany sobbing about her latte, and my mother staring at me with a mixture of horror and dawning realization. I asked her a simple question, my voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. I asked if she knew about the theft, or if she had chosen not to know because the truth was too inconvenient. She didn't answer, but the way she leaned against the wall for support told me everything I needed to know about the willful blindness that had allowed a parasite to feed on our family for 10 years. Just as the chaos seemed to be peaking, Frank pulled a maneuver that I later came to call the reverse victim shuffle, a move so audacious and calculating that I almost had to admire the sheer sociopathy required to execute it. 3 days after Christmas, while I was sitting in my apartment sifting through the legal fallout and feeling a premature sense of victory, my doorbell rang at 7 in the morning. It wasn't Frank this time, but a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a laboratory dedicated to producing high-end corporate sharks. He had silver hair coiffed to aerodynamic perfection, a suit that cost more than my annual salary, and a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He introduced himself as Richard Steinberg, a lawyer known in the city for getting white-collar criminals off on technicalities and burying whistleblowers under mountains of litigation. He handed me a thick stack of papers with a flourish,
informing me that Frank was suing me for $2 million. The charges were breathtaking in their creativity: corporate espionage, defamation of character, unauthorized access to electronic devices, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Frank had managed to convince a wealthy golf buddy to loan him the retainer fee, betting everything on a counter-offensive that would paint me as the villain. The lawsuit was designed to destroy me, not just financially, but professionally and socially. Steinberg explained in a smooth, menacing baritone that my access to Frank's phone, even though it was unlocked and left in a common area, constituted a violation of privacy laws that could land me in prison. He claimed that I had used my position as a compliance officer to fabricate the evidence of fraud, manipulating the data to frame a loving stepfather who had only ever tried to help me. To make matters worse, they had found two of my former co-workers, Kelly and Marcus, who had been fired for expense fraud the previous year. These two were apparently willing to testify that I had bragged in the break room about my plans to take down my family and steal the inheritance for myself. It was a lie, of course, but in the legal world, a lie told by two witnesses is often worth more than the truth told by one. I stood there in my doorway, holding the heavy legal brief, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet, as I realized that Frank wasn't just going to roll over and die, he was going to burn the whole world down to save himself. But the real blow, the one that nearly knocked the wind out of me, came at noon that same day. Brittany arrived at my building, not with a lawyer, but with a camera crew led by a YouTuber named Chad, who specialized in exposing family drama. She stood in the hallway outside my door, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, filming a segment about how she was being victimized by a jealous, mentally unstable stepsister who had always hated her for being beautiful. She spun a narrative that was terrifyingly effective, claiming that I had hacked her father's accounts, planted fake incriminating documents, and edited the video of the fall to make it look like a push. The internet, which loves a conspiracy theory more than the truth, began to turn. The hashtag falsely accused started trending, and within hours I was receiving death threats from strangers who believed I was a monster trying to destroy a hard-working family man. My company called to inform me that I was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into the allegations of corporate espionage. I was alone, isolated, and watching my victory turn into a nightmare. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was trembling, but this time it wasn't with anger at Frank. She asked me, in a whisper that broke my heart, if I had planted the evidence. She said Frank's lawyer had shown her documents that looked very convincing, and she didn't know what to believe anymore. The silence that followed her question was louder than the fall at dinner. The media campaign against me reached a fever pitch the next morning when Frank appeared on a local morning talk show, the kind of program that usually sandwiched hard news between segments on holiday cookie decorating and adopting rescue poodles. He sat on the beige sofa, wearing his best navy suit, looking for all the world like a distinguished statesman who had been wronged by a vindictive child. He had perfected what I called his wounded deer expression, eyes shimmering with unshed tears, as he told the host about how he had raised me like his own flesh and blood, how he had sacrificed everything to keep our family together after my father passed, and how painful it was to be betrayed by someone he loved. The host, a woman with heavily sprayed hair who clearly had not fact-checked a single word of his story, nodded sympathetically and murmured about how difficult it must be to deal with adult children who refuse to launch. Watching him spin this narrative while I sat in my apartment, suspended from my job and alienated from my family, was a visceral kind of torture. It felt as if the truth didn't matter anymore, only the story that could be sold the loudest. Frank spoke about the quote 7 of the allegations, his voice cracking at the perfect moments, painting me as a greedy, mentally unstable woman who was jealous of her stepsister's success. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and for a terrifying moment, I wondered if he was actually going to win. Meanwhile, Richard Steinberg was earning every cent of his exorbitant retainer fee by systematically dismantling my defense with terrifying legal precision. He had found a loophole in the state's privacy laws regarding electronic devices, arguing that even though Frank's phone had been unlocked, my accessing it to photograph the messages constituted unauthorized intrusion into private communications. He filed motion after motion, burying me in paperwork, and managed to get a hearing scheduled for December 30th before Judge Harold Feinstein. This was bad news, because Feinstein was notorious in legal circles for being a rigid formalist who despised vigilante justice and often favoured the, quote, eight over financial discrepancies. Steinberg was painting a picture of me as a hacker and a thief who had manipulated my senile grandmother into participating in a conspiracy. He even suggested that the, quote, 9 I had found was a forgery I created using my compliance skills. The narrative was sticking. My neighbours were avoiding eye contact in the hallway. My LinkedIn inbox was full of hate mail, and even cousin Jennifer had stopped texting back, unsure of what to believe amidst the chaos. I sat alone in the dark, staring at my father's laptop, wondering if I had played my hand too early, if I had underestimated the sheer weight of the lies Frank was willing to tell. But just as the darkness seemed absolute, the first crack appeared in Frank's meticulously constructed fortress, and it came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Frank's reputation management campaign was being run by a man named Doug, a self-proclaimed crisis PR expert who operated out of his mother's basement in the suburbs. Doug had been effective at first, using bot farms to trend hashtags and editing the video of my fall. But his operation had a fatal flaw. His mother, Barbara. It turned out that Barbara was an avid reader who belonged to a massive network of book clubs that spanned 3 states. When Doug carelessly left a file open on the kitchen table with Frank's photo on it, Barbara didn't see a grieving stepfather. She saw a man she had met 15 years ago in Phoenix. She recognized him not as Frank Morrison, but as Francis Morris Walsh, a charming investment banker who had romanced the treasurer of her book club, drained her life savings, and then vanished into the night, leaving her with a second mortgage and a broken heart. Barbara didn't just tell her son, she activated the book club network. Within 6 hours, 14 different women from Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado had come forward with identical stories. They were all widows, all vulnerable, and all victims of a man who changed his last name like other people change socks. The cascade of failures that followed was breathtaking in its speed and severity. Kelly and Marcus, my former co-workers who had agreed to testify that I was a corporate spy, suddenly developed a severe case of moral conscience. This change of heart was brought about by 2 FBI agents knocking on their doors at 6 a.m. to ask them about perjury and federal conspiracy charges. It turns out that lying to a federal investigator carries a prison sentence of up to 5 years, a reality that Richard Steinberg had neglected to mention when he bribed them. They flipped faster than a short-order cook at a diner, signing sworn affidavits that Frank had paid them $5,000 each to fabricate their stories. They even provided the text messages where Frank had coached them on what to say, detailing exactly how they should describe my quote 10, quote 11. But the final nail in the legal coffin came from inside Steinberg's own office. His paralegal, a quiet, overlooked woman named Dorothy, had been silently documenting every illegal move her boss made for years. She had been waiting for the right moment to strike, fueled by her own history with a predatory stepfather. She walked into the district attorney's office with what she called her 12, a collection of colour-coded transcripts and audio recordings proving that Steinberg and Frank were actively conspiring to fabricate evidence and suborn perjury. While the legal case was imploding, the court of public opinion was about to get a shock of its own. Brittany, in her infinite need for attention, had hired a documentary filmmaker named Chad to follow her around and capture her 13. Chad was live streaming footage to build buzz for his channel, thinking he was documenting a tragedy, but he was actually broadcasting a confession. He had left his camera rolling in the hallway while Brittany was on the phone with one of her friends, unaware that the microphone was sensitive enough to pick up her whisper.
Thousands of people watched live as Brittany complained that her father was an idiot for getting caught, admitting that she knew he was guilty of fraud, but that she didn't care because they needed the money to pay off her debts to Big Tony. She laughed about how easy it was to manipulate the media and called me a pathetic little accountant who deserved to be crushed. She even mentioned the side business again, complaining that the fake bags were taking up too much space in the warehouse. The comments section of the livestream transformed instantly from sympathy to outrage. The clip was ripped, shared, and reposted 1,000,000 times within the hour. By the time Brittany realised what had happened, she had lost every sponsor she had ever had, and the hashtag Prison Princess was trending worldwide. By the evening of December 29th, the day before the hearing, Frank was back at my door. The transformation from the arrogant man on the morning news to the creature standing in my hallway was absolute. He was alone this time. No lawyers, no Brittany, no bluster. He looked small, shrunken inside his expensive coat, his eyes darting nervously at the shadows in the hallway. He didn't demand entry. He begged for it. When I let him in, he didn't try to intimidate me. Instead, he tried to bribe me. He sat at my kitchen table, sweating profusely, and offered me $50,000 to drop the emails and sign a non-disclosure agreement. When I didn't respond, he raised it to $100,000. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he told me to name my price. He said we were family, that we could work this out, that he could cut me in on the business if I just made the evidence disappear. I sat there, stone-faced, my phone recording every pathetic word, realizing that this man had never loved my mother, never cared for us. He was just a desperate grifter trying to buy his way out of a cage. I didn't say a word until he finished his pitch. Then I simply pointed to the door. He was about to leave, defeated, when the door opened and my mother walked in. She looked different than she had 2 days ago. The fog of grief and manipulation that had clouded her eyes for a decade seemed to have lifted, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She was holding a heavy metal box, a safety deposit box that she had retrieved from the bank that afternoon. She ignored Frank completely, walking past him as if he were a piece of furniture, and set the box on the table. She told me that after our conversation in the hallway, she had gone to the bank to check on something my father had mentioned in his final days, something she had been too distraught to investigate at the time. Inside the box were reports from a private investigator my father had hired 6 months before he died. My father had known. He had suspected Frank was a con artist, but the cancer had taken him before he could finalize the divorce or the prosecution. Mother pulled out a digital recorder from the box, an old model from 10 years ago, and pressed play. Frank's voice filled the room, younger and more arrogant, bragging to an associate about landing the widow jackpot and how easy it would be to bleed the company dry once the old man kicked the bucket. The colour drained from Frank's face so completely that he looked like a corpse. He tried to stammer an explanation, claiming the recording was taken out of context, that it was a joke. But my mother silenced him with a look so withering it could have stripped paint. She told him that she had spent 10 years thinking she was honouring her husband by keeping the family together. But she realised now that she had been sleeping with the enemy. She told him to get out of her sight and that she would see him in court, not as his wife, but as the primary witness for the prosecution. Frank slinked out of the apartment like a beaten dog, leaving behind the silence of a room that had finally been cleansed of his lies. My mother collapsed into the chair, weeping not for him, but for the years she had lost and for the apology she owed me. We sat there for a long time, holding hands across the table, 2 survivors in the wreckage of a war we hadn't known we were fighting. But the night wasn't over. There was one final piece of the puzzle that I had to confront. After my mother went home to rest, I sat alone with my father's laptop again. There was one folder I had been avoiding. A digital directory labelled simply, "For my daughter, open when ready." I had been afraid to click on it, afraid that it would just be a goodbye letter that would break my heart all over again. But after seeing the PI reports and hearing the recording, I knew it was more than that.
I took a deep breath, the cursor trembling slightly on the screen, and double-clicked the folder. The first file that opened was not a document, but a video file. My father's face filled the screen, gaunt and pale from the chemotherapy, but his eyes were bright with that sharp, mischievous intelligence I remembered so well. He was sitting in his study, wearing his favourite cardigan, looking directly into the camera lens, as if he were looking into my soul. He began to speak, his voice raspy but steady. He said, "Simona, if you are watching this, it means Frank Morrison has finally shown his true colours, and you are ready to fight back." He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I couldn't stop him then, my love. I was too weak. But I have left you the weapons you need to finish what I started. And I didn't work alone." He held up a file with a name on it that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. My father's voice on the video was a lifeline thrown across the abyss of death, steady and reassuring despite the obvious physical toll the cancer had taken on his body. He explained to the camera, and to me across the span of time, that he had known about Frank's true nature for the last 6 months of his life, but had been too physically weak to fight a legal battle that might leave my mother destitute and vulnerable during his final days. Instead, he had chosen to play a much longer, more dangerous game, one that required infinite patience and a level of deception that went against his honest nature. He revealed that the will Frank had found in the safe, the one he had triumphantly burned in the fireplace, thinking he was destroying the evidence, was a complete fabrication, planted there specifically for him to find. The real will, the ironclad document that placed every asset into a trust protected by layers of legal armour, was safely filed with his attorney, Mitchell Reeves, in Denver, a man Frank didn't even know existed. But the trap went deeper than just paperwork. My father explained that the business accounts Frank had been draining were actually, quote, 25 digital traps set up with the cooperation of federal authorities to track every single cent of illegal activity. Every time Frank transferred money to an offshore shell company, he was essentially signing a confession that was being logged on a secure server in Quantico. My father wiped a tear from his eye on the screen and whispered that he knew he wouldn't be there to see the trap spring, but he had total faith that his daughter would be strong enough to pull the trigger when the time came. The next file in the folder was labelled with a name and a phone number that made my hands tremble as I reached for my cell phone. Agent Sarah Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I dialed the number, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting a voicemail or a bureaucratic receptionist. But the line was answered on the second ring by a woman with a voice like polished steel. She didn't ask who I was. She simply said that she had been wondering when I would finally call. As my father had predicted, I would find the laptop eventually. What she told me next shattered the last remnants of the reality I thought I knew. Agent Chen wasn't just a distant investigator monitoring spreadsheets. She was the woman Frank knew as Tiffany, his dedicated executive secretary and the mistress he had been bragging about to his golf buddies for the last 3 years. Frank believed he was having a clandestine affair with a 25-year-old admirer who was fascinated by his business acumen. In reality, he had been confessing his crimes to a federal agent wearing a wire every single day. She explained that the FBI had been building a massive RICO case against an international fraud ring, and Frank was a mid-level player they were using to get to the bigger fish. The side business, involving fake luxury goods, wasn't just about knockoff handbags. It was a money laundering operation for a cartel that the Bureau had been tracking for a decade. Agent Chen told me that by filing the lawsuit against me, Frank had officially crossed the line into witness tampering and federal wire fraud, giving them the final predicate act they needed to move in. The scope of the deception was so vast, it was almost impossible to comprehend. But my father had left one more tool in his digital arsenal to ensure Frank's destruction was absolute. A folder labelled, quote, 28, contained a spreadsheet with the names, addresses and phone numbers of 11 other women,
victims my father and his private investigator had tracked down before he died. These were the women Barbara from the book club had alluded to, but the list was far more comprehensive than a few local widows. Over the next 12 hours, while the snow began to fall outside, covering the city in a blanket of white, I worked the phones. I connected Barbara with the list, and what formed was less of a support group and more of an avenging army. We had women from 3 different time zones, each with a story of a charming man named Francis, or Frank, or Franklin, who had swept them off their feet before sweeping their bank accounts clean. They had been isolated, ashamed, and silent for years, believing they were the only ones foolish enough to fall for his lies. But as we connected them, shame turned into righteous fury. By midnight, they had formed a collective, hired a class action attorney who was willing to work on contingency solely for the pleasure of destroying a predator, and were preparing to file a massive civil suit that would freeze every asset Frank had ever touched. Before the sun rose on the morning of December 30th, I opened the final video file my father had left for me. The timestamp showed it was recorded the day before he entered hospice care, a day I remembered vividly because he had asked to spend it in my old childhood bedroom. The video showed him sitting on the edge of my twin bed, holding the tattered teddy bear he had given me when I was 5 years old, the one with the missing button eye. He looked directly at the camera, his breathing laboured, and told me 3 things that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. First, he told me how proud he was of the woman I had become, seeing my strength even when I couldn't see it myself. Second, he asked me to be patient with my mother, explaining that grief can make people vulnerable to parasites and that she would need my help to find her way back to herself. And third, he smiled that mischievous, crooked smile I missed so much and said that Frank's biggest mistake was underestimating me. He said Frank saw a quiet compliance officer, but he didn't realise that I had inherited the fighting spirit of the Cunninghams. He ended the video by placing the bear gently on the pillow and whispering that justice isn't about revenge, it is about balance, and it was up to me to restore the balance of our universe. I sat there in the dark, tears streaming down my face, feeling the weight of his love and the steel of his resolve settling into my bones. December 30th arrived not with a whimper, but with a blizzard and a SWAT team. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy silence of our upscale apartment building was shattered by the sound of a battering ram hitting the penthouse door 3 floors above me. The FBI, it turns out, does not believe in polite knocks or sleeping in. I stood in my doorway, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the parade of chaos descend the stairs. Frank was led out first, handcuffed and wearing only his silk boxers and a t-shirt that said, "World's Best Boss," a garment that was now dripping with irony. He looked disoriented and terrified, his face pale and his eyes wide as he scanned the hallway, locking eyes with me for a split second before the agents shoved him forward. Behind him came Brittany, screaming at the top of her lungs about her constitutional rights and how this was going to ruin her brand, while an agent calmly read her the Miranda rights. And trailing behind them was Doug, the reputation management guy, who had apparently spent the night on Frank's couch trying to manage the crisis and was now being arrested for obstruction of justice. He was weeping openly, asking if he could call his mother, unaware that his mother was the one who had helped burn their operation to the ground. It was a scene of absolute devastation, the complete dismantling of a false kingdom in less than 15 minutes. The hearing scheduled for that morning before Judge Feinstein was supposed to be a simple civil matter regarding the lawsuit Frank had filed against me. But by the time the court convened at 10 o'clock, the atmosphere had shifted from administrative to apocalyptic. The courtroom was packed, not just with the usual legal vultures, but with the 14 women of the Victims Network who had flown, driven, and bussed in from across the country to see the man who had ruined their lives. They sat in the front rows, a silent phalanx of grey hair and sensible coats, staring at the defence table with a collective intensity that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Judge Feinstein, who had been prepared to lecture me on the sanctity of privacy, looked bewildered as the federal prosecutor, a woman named Jessica Torres, who looked like she ate defense attorneys for breakfast, stepped forward. She informed the court that the civil matter was now moot because the defendant, Frank Morrison, was currently in federal custody facing 47 counts of wire fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and witness tampering. Richard Steinberg, Frank's high-priced lawyer, tried to withdraw from the case on the spot, actually tripping over his briefcase in his haste to distance himself from his radioactive client. But the judge ordered him to sit down and shut up. Then came the moment that made the entire courtroom gasp, a moment of theatrical justice that not even my father could have scripted better. The prosecution called their first witness for the bail hearing, Special Agent Sarah Chen. The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the woman Frank knew as his devoted, adoring secretary Tiffany walked in. She was not wearing the short skirts and heavy makeup Frank preferred. She was wearing a sharp federal uniform, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. The sound that escaped Frank's throat was a strangled, high-pitched whimper, the sound of a man realizing that his entire reality was a hallucination. Agent Chen took the stand and proceeded to dismantle Frank's life with surgical precision. She detailed 3 years of undercover work, playing recordings of Frank laughing about how easy it was to manipulate, quote, 30, quote, and bragging about the illegal inventory he was moving through the family warehouse. She presented the court with the, quote, 31 logs, showing exactly where every stolen dollar had gone, including the funds he had drained from Brittany's tuition to pay off gambling debts. But the testimony that turned the room from shocked to horrified came when Agent Chen opened a file regarding Frank's activities during the last month of my father's life. She explained to the hushed courtroom that the FBI had intercepted a plan Frank had discussed with a contact in Mexico, a plan to accelerate my father's death by switching his pain medication with a compound that would induce heart failure. The only reason the plan hadn't been executed was because my father had died of natural causes 2 days before the shipment arrived. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room, and my mother let out a sob that sounded like something tearing deep inside her chest. Frank wasn't just a thief or a con man. He was an attempted murderer who had been stopped only by the grim mercy of cancer. I looked at Frank, who was slumped in his chair, shrinking under the weight of the truth, and then I looked at Brittany. She was sitting behind the defense table, her face a mask of horror, realizing that the father she had idolized was a monster who had been willing to kill for money. The prosecutor then announced that they had one more witness to call, someone who could speak to the defendant's character and his recent activities from the inside. The courtroom doors opened again, and everyone turned to see who could possibly add to this mountain of damnation. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a groan that sounded like a tomb unsealing, and the air in the room seemed to freeze as Brittany Morrison walked in, flanked by 2 federal marshals. She was not wearing her usual designer armor or the entitled sneer that had been her trademark for a decade. Instead, she wore a simple grey cardigan and slacks, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, looking terrified and strangely young. Frank half rose from his seat, his mouth opening to say her name, but his lawyer yanked him back down so hard his head snapped back. Brittany took the stand, refusing to look at her father, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind the judge's head as she was sworn in. When the prosecutor asked her relationship to the defendant, she hesitated for a long, painful second before stating that he was her father, but she was testifying as a cooperating witness for the prosecution, in exchange for leniency regarding her own fraud charges. The sound that came from Frank was not human. It was the sound of an animal whose leg had just been caught in a steel trap, a mixture of disbelief and agony that echoed off the high ceilings. Brittany proceeded to unravel the last threads of Frank's defense with a cold, desperate efficiency. She admitted that she had known about the embezzlement,
that she had willingly spent the stolen money. But then she dropped the bombshell that sealed his fate. She told the court that she had started recording her conversations with Frank 6 months ago, not out of conscience, but as an insurance policy, because she knew he would eventually throw her under the bus to save himself. She played a recording from her phone where Frank explicitly detailed how they would blame the accounting irregularities on me if the IRS ever came knocking, laughing about how no one would believe the, quote, 32. The fallout from Brittany's testimony was immediate and catastrophic for the defense. Richard Steinberg, realizing that his client was radioactive and that his own paralegal had already handed over evidence of his corruption, sat in stunned silence as the judge ordered the bailiff to take Frank into custody immediately. The federal prosecutor, Jessica Torres, wasn't finished. She called an IRS special agent to the stand who looked like he enjoyed audits a little too much. He spent 20 minutes detailing the tax implications of Frank's schemes, noting that Frank owed $1,400,000 in back taxes, but with penalties and interest, the figure was closer to $3 million. He testified that they had already frozen every single asset, including the loose change in Frank's car and the offshore accounts he thought were invisible. The judge, Harold Feinstein, who had started the day thinking this was a simple family dispute, looked down at Frank with undisguised disgust. He declared Frank a flight risk, citing the passport flagged at the airport and the ticket to Costa Rica, and ordered him held without bail until sentencing. As the marshals hauled Frank to his feet, he finally looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, only a bottomless, terrifying realization that the nobody he had pushed at dinner had just pushed back with the force of the United States government. He was led away in handcuffs, the click of the metal echoing like the final period at the end of a long, terrible sentence. New Year's Eve arrived 48 hours later, bringing with it a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in 10 years. We gathered at my grandmother's house, as she had declared the old venue tainted by Frank's presence and refused to set foot in it ever again. The atmosphere was surreal. The same 23 people who had watched in silence as I fell were now treating me like a returning war hero. Uncle Ted was there, looking sheepish but enthusiastic, having discovered that his viral video of my fall had been licensed by a major news network for a documentary about domestic fraud. He pulled me aside, handing me a glass of champagne and a check for $5,000, half of his licensing fee, telling me it was the start of his, quote, 34 for being a bystander to my humiliation. Cousin Jennifer was beaming, introducing everyone to her new boyfriend, David, who just happened to be the forensic accountant from the FBI team that had cracked Frank's shell companies. But the most significant change was my mother. She arrived wearing a vibrant red dress, a colour my father had loved on her, but Frank had forbidden because he said it was, quote, 35, quote. She looked like she had woken up from a long, dark dream. She didn't make a big speech to the room. Instead, she found me on the balcony as midnight approached, took my hands in hers, and apologised not just for the silence, but for the weakness that had allowed a predator to feed on our family. She told me she had been grieving so hard she let him take the wheel, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure I never felt unsupported again. At exactly midnight, as the fireworks exploded over the city skyline and Auld Lang Syne played in the background, my phone buzzed with a single notification. It was an automated email from my father's law firm in Denver. The subject line read, "Trust activation confirmed." I opened it to find a legal confirmation that, effective January 1st, the Cunningham Family Trust was now under my sole control. The house, the logistics company, the investment portfolio, everything my father had built and protected was officially mine. The Simona's throne clause had triggered, transferring ownership of the family estate to me the moment Frank was indicted for a felony. I looked around the room at my family, flawed and messy, but finally free of the poison that had infected us, and I raised my glass to the night sky. Somewhere in a federal detention centre, Frank was sitting in a concrete cell, likely listening to the distant sounds of celebration,
realizing that the new year brought him nothing but a cold cot and a lawyer who was currently negotiating his own plea deal. The balance my father had spoken about had been restored. The predator was in a cage, and the prey was running the kingdom. 6 months later, I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse, watching the final act of this tragedy play out. The sentencing hearing was presided over by Judge Patricia Hawkins, a woman known for her severity in white-collar crime cases. Frank stood before her, looking like a husk of the man he used to be. He had lost 30 pounds, his hair was white and thinning, and his expensive suit hung off him like a costume. He had pleaded guilty to 47 counts in a desperate attempt to get leniency. But Judge Hawkins was not in a forgiving mood. She delivered a blistering lecture on the cruelty of preying on widows and the depravity of plotting to kill a dying man. She sentenced Frank to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15. The courtroom, usually a place of decorum, erupted in spontaneous applause, led by the 14 women of the victims' network who were sitting in the gallery wearing matching Justice for Widows pins. Brittany, for her cooperation, received 2 years of probation and 3,000 hours of community service. In a twist of poetic justice that the universe rarely provides, she had found employment at a McDonald's to pay her restitution. I had stopped by once, anonymously, and watched her mopping the floors with a grim determination that suggested she might actually be learning the character lessons Frank had claimed to be teaching me. The aftermath of the trial was a renaissance for everyone Frank had tried to bury. The logistics company, freed from Frank's embezzlement and toxic management style, rebounded with incredible speed. I instituted a profit-sharing model for the employees who had stuck with us, and productivity soared by 40% within the first quarter. My mother sold the house Frank had tainted and bought a beautiful cottage near the beach, where she spent her days painting and volunteering. She had even started dating again, seeing Mitchell Reeves, the Denver attorney who had kept my father's secret will safe all those years. He was a kind, quiet man who treated her with a reverence that made my heart ache in the best way. The Victims Network had formalized into a non-profit organization called the Simona Foundation, dedicated to helping women identify financial abuse and recover their stolen assets. Barbara from the book club served as the president, and they had already helped recover over $2 million for other victims of romance scams. Agent Sarah Chen had become a close friend, often joining us for Sunday dinners, and she used Frank's case as a primary teaching example at the FBI Academy in Quantico, ensuring that his legacy would be serving as a warning to future agents. But the true closure came on a rainy Tuesday, when I drove to the federal penitentiary to visit inmate number 4847329. I sat behind the thick glass partition, watching Frank shuffle into the room in his orange jumpsuit, looking grey and defeated. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling, and tried to start with some manipulative nonsense about how he missed us and how hard prison was for a man of his refinement. I didn't say a word. I simply held up a photograph against the glass. It was a picture taken at our most recent family dinner. The table was set beautifully, the candles were lit, and at the head of the table was my father's empty chair. But in front of it was a bronze plaque that read, "I told him through the phone that the seat was never about power or hierarchy. It was about belonging, and he would never understand that because he had never truly belonged to anyone. I told him that his one push had cost him his freedom, his daughter, and his fortune, while it had given me back my voice and my family." He stared at the photo, his eyes filling with tears, finally comprehending the magnitude of his loss. I hung up the phone while he was still stammering, stood up, and walked out of the prison without looking back, leaving him alone with the silence he had once tried to impose on me. A year after the incident, we gathered for Christmas dinner again, but the table had grown. Sarah Chen was there, along with her partner, and several women from the foundation who had nowhere else to go for the holidays. Even Brittany had been invited, though she had politely declined, sending a card saying she was volunteering at a homeless shelter and needed to focus on her own redemption before she could face us. The mood was boisterous and warm, filled with the kind of laughter that comes from people who have walked through fire together. My grandmother, now 86 and sharper than ever, tapped her glass for a toast. The room went quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, not the fearful one of the past. She raised her glass and said that last year we learned that silence in the face of injustice makes us accomplices, but this year we learned that justice is worth fighting for. She looked at me and added that sometimes you have to be pushed down to realize you have the strength to stand up taller than before. We all drank to that, and as I looked around the table at the faces of the people I loved, I thought about my father's final message. Justice isn't revenge, and it is balance. The scales had been righted. Frank was rotting in a cell, my mother was happy, the company was safe, and I was sitting in my chair, not because I inherited it, but because I had fought for it. They say you should be careful who you step on, because they might be the ones holding the ladder. But Frank learned a harder lesson that night. Be careful who you push down at Christmas dinner. They might have a dead father who planned for this exact moment, an FBI agent posing as a mistress, and a grandmother who documents crimes while pretending to be confused by her smartphone. The price of that one moment of cruelty was everything he had ever built. He thought he was pushing a weak, compliant stepdaughter out of her seat. Instead, he pushed the first domino in a chain reaction that destroyed his entire world. As I took a bite of the cranberry sauce, which stayed perfectly on my plate this time, I smiled. It turns out that revenge is a dish best served cold. But justice? Justice tastes like warm Christmas pudding and absolute victory. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed watching a scammer get exactly what he deserved, please hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always comes out in the end.